Story 1. The Disappearance of Asha Degree. Welcome back to Mr. Crime and Sleep, your late-night companion for long-form true crime, narrated slowly and calmly to help you drift off into a deep, restful sleep. Tonight, we have 5 haunting stories, cases where victims vanished in silence, where cries for help were never heard, and where the truth still lingers somewhere in the dark. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Take a slow, deep breath in and let it go. Let's begin. Our first story takes us to Shelby, North Carolina, a small, quiet town where everybody knew everybody, and where one little girl's disappearance would shake an entire community to its core. Asha Degree was 9 years old. She was a shy, well-behaved girl who loved basketball and reading. She lived with her parents, Harold and Equia, and her older brother, O'Brien, in a modest home on Oakcrest Drive. By all accounts, the Degree family was close-knit. Asha's parents worked hard. Her father held a job at a local factory, and her mother worked at a nursing home. They were protective of their children, and Asha had never shown any signs of wanting to run away. On the evening of February 13th, 2000, a Sunday night, the family had a normal evening at home. There had been a power outage earlier that day due to a storm, so the family spent most of the evening together by candlelight. Asha and O'Brien shared a bedroom. Their father checked on them around 2:30 in the morning and saw both children sleeping peacefully in their beds. But when he checked again around 6:15 that morning, Asha's bed was empty. At first, Harold assumed she might be in the bathroom, but she wasn't. She wasn't anywhere in the house. Her parents searched every room, every closet, the yard, the street. They called family, friends, neighbors. No one had seen her. By that afternoon, the Shelby Police Department had launched a full search. What made this case so puzzling from the very beginning was the weather. That night, February 14th, Valentine's Day, in the early morning hours, there was a severe storm, heavy rain, strong winds, temperatures near freezing. It was not the kind of night anyone would choose to go outside, let alone a 9-year-old girl. And yet, witnesses would soon come forward with something deeply unsettling. 2 separate motorists reported seeing a small girl walking alone along Highway 18, a rural 2-lane road, sometime between 3:30 and 4:15 in the morning. One of them, a truck driver named Jeff Rupa, said he saw her walking south along the road. He was so startled by the sight of a child alone in the storm that he turned his truck around to check on her. But when he circled back, she ran into the woods and disappeared into the tree line. Think about that for a moment. A 9-year-old girl walking alone in a rainstorm in the middle of the night along a dark highway, and when a stranger tries to help, she runs away, not toward safety, into the woods. What was she running from? Or who had told her to run? The search expanded rapidly. Volunteers combed the woods near Highway 18. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters circled overhead. And about a mile from where the motorists had spotted Asha, investigators found something. Inside a storage shed at the edge of a wooded area, they discovered some of Asha's belongings: candy wrappers, a pencil, a Mickey Mouse hair bow. It appeared she had taken shelter there, at least for a short time. But beyond that shed, the trail went cold. For over a year, there were no new leads. Then, in August of 2001, a construction crew working along Highway 18, about 26 miles north of Shelby, unearthed a buried book bag. It was double-wrapped in black plastic garbage bags and buried in a shallow hole. Inside was Asha's book bag, containing her clothes and personal items. Someone had deliberately hidden it. This was no accident. This was not the work of a child. The FBI joined the investigation. Over the years, several items from the book bag were made public in hopes that someone might recognize them. Among them was a Dr. Seuss book, McElligot's Pool, that did not belong to Asha and had reportedly been checked out from a school library in a neighboring county. There was also a New Kids on the Block t-shirt, a band that was popular a decade before Asha was born, suggesting it may have belonged to someone older. Despite hundreds of interviews, searches of nearby properties, and even excavations, Asha Degree has never been found. No body, no confirmed sighting after that night, no arrest. In 2022, the FBI executed search warrants on 2 properties in Shelby. While no details were made public, the Bureau confirmed the searches were connected to Asha's case. Then, in 2024, investigators announced they had identified a vehicle of interest, a dark green Lincoln Continental from the early 1970s, seen in the area the night she vanished. The question that haunts everyone who hears this story is the same question that haunted investigators from day one. Why did Asha leave? She was afraid of the dark. She was afraid of storms. She was a rule follower. And yet, in the middle of a freezing rainstorm at 3 a.m, she packed a bag, left her house, and walked down a dark highway alone. Some believe she was lured by someone she trusted, perhaps through a letter or a promise. Some believe she was running from something no one knew about. And some believe the answer lies in that green car. What we do know is this. Asha Degree walked into the night on February 14th, 2000, and she never came home. Her parents still live in the same house on Oakcrest Drive. They still keep her room exactly the way she left it. And every year on Valentine's Day, they hold a vigil, waiting for the answers that have never come. Take a slow breath. Let the weight of that story settle for a moment. When you're ready, we'll move on to our next case. Hashtag Story 2, The Vanishing of Brandon Lawson. Our second story tonight takes us deep into the heart of West Texas. A vast, empty stretch of land where the nearest town can be 30 miles away, where the highways cut through nothing but dust, scrub brush, and silence. It is a place where, if something happens to you, there may be no one around to hear it. Brandon Lawson was 26 years old in the summer of 2013. He was a father, a boyfriend, and by most accounts, a man who had been through some difficult chapters in his life, but was trying to turn things around. He lived in San Angelo, Texas, with his girlfriend, Ladessa Lofton, and their young son. The couple also helped raise Brandon's children from a previous relationship. Life wasn't always easy. Brandon had a history of substance use, and there had been some tension in the home. But those who knew him described him as someone who cared deeply about his family, someone who was trying. On the evening of August 8th, 2013, Brandon and Ledessa got into an argument. It wasn't violent, but it was heated. Feeling frustrated, Brandon decided to leave the house. He told Ledessa he was going to drive to his father's home in Crowley, Texas, a town roughly 3 hours northeast of San Angelo. It was late, around 11:30 at night. Ledessa asked him not to go. She told him it was too late to be driving that far, but Brandon was determined. He got in his truck, a white Dodge Ram, and pulled out of the driveway. That was the last time Ledessa Lofton saw Brandon Lawson alive. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to understand the geography. The route from San Angelo to Crowley takes you through some of the most remote stretches of highway in all of Texas. Long, flat roads with no streetlights, no gas stations, no houses for miles and miles. Just open land, darkness, and the occasional pair of headlights passing in the other direction. Brandon took U.S. Highway 277, heading north out of San Angelo. It was a road he had driven before. He knew the route. But on this particular night, something went wrong. At approximately 12:45 in the morning, about an hour and 15 minutes into his drive, Brandon called Ledessa. He told her he had run out of gas. His truck was stranded on the side of the highway, somewhere near the small town of Bronte, Texas. Bronte is a tiny community in Coke County, population of less than 1,000 people. At that hour, the town would have been completely dark and silent. Ledessa told Brandon she would send help. She called Brandon's brother, Kyle Lawson, who lived closer to the area, and asked him to drive out and bring Brandon some fuel. But before Kyle could arrive, Brandon made another call, and this is where the story takes a deeply unsettling turn. At 12:54 in the morning, just 9 minutes after his call to Ledessa, Brandon dialed 911. The call lasted approximately 1 minute and 40 seconds, and to this day, it remains one of the most chilling and debated pieces of evidence in any missing persons case in the United States. The 911 recording is difficult to hear. Brandon sounds out of breath. He sounds frightened. His words are broken, rushed, and at times nearly impossible to make out. There is wind noise. There may be other sounds in the background. The dispatcher struggles to understand him. What Brandon appears to say, and people have debated this for years, includes fragments like, "I totally ran into them. We're not talking to them. I accidentally ran into something," and what some listeners interpret as, "There's one guy talking to them. I need the cops." He seems to be describing a situation involving other people, not a simple car breakdown, not just running out of gas, something else, something that scared him enough to call 911 in the middle of the night, a deserted highway. The dispatcher asked Brandon for his location. He gave a rough description. Somewhere on Highway 277 near Bronte. The dispatcher told him she would send someone. The call ended, and then silence. Kyle Lawson arrived at the location Brandon had described sometime around 1:10 in the morning. He found Brandon's white Dodge Ram on the side of the road, parked at an angle near a fence line. The truck was empty. The doors were unlocked. Brandon's wallet and some of his personal belongings were still inside, but Brandon was gone. Kyle looked around. He called Brandon's name. He drove up and down the highway, searching. Nothing. No sign of his brother anywhere. Around the same time, a Coke County Sheriff's deputy arrived at the scene, responding to Brandon's 911 call. The deputy also found the truck empty. He noted the location, ran the plates, and confirmed the vehicle belonged to Brandon Lawson. A brief search of the immediate area turned up nothing. Here is something important to note. Kyle and the deputy were both at the scene around the same time, but they apparently did not encounter each other. Some have speculated about the exact timing and whether there was a gap between their arrivals, but the key fact remains the same. When help arrived, Brandon was already gone. In the hours and days that followed, Brandon's family tried desperately to reach him. His phone went straight to voicemail. LaDessa filed a missing persons report. Kyle returned to the area in daylight and searched on foot. Local volunteers joined in. The terrain around that stretch of Highway 277 is brutal. It's open ranchland, dry, thorny, full of mesquite and cactus. In August, daytime temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, the land is pitch black with no artificial light for miles. There are barbed wire fences, cattle gates, dry creek beds, and, crucially, several large oil field operations with heavy equipment and storage tanks scattered across the landscape. If Brandon had wandered off the road into that land, in the dark, possibly disoriented, it would have been extraordinarily easy to become lost, to fall, to succumb to the heat the following day, to simply vanish. But that theory, that Brandon simply wandered into the wilderness, doesn't explain the 911 call. If he had just run out of gas, why did he sound afraid? Why did he mention other people? Why did he call 911 instead of waiting for Kyle? And if there were other people at the scene, who were they? What did they want? And where did they go? Over the years, multiple theories have emerged. The first, and perhaps the simplest, is that Brandon was disoriented, possibly under the influence of a substance, and that the 911 call was the confused rambling of a man in a state of panic or paranoia. In this scenario, Brandon wandered away from his truck, crossed into the ranchland, and died of exposure, dehydration, or an accident. His remains in that vast and unforgiving terrain simply haven't been found. The second theory is that Brandon encountered someone on that highway, another driver, a stranger, someone with ill intent, and that whatever happened during that encounter led to his disappearance. This theory is supported by the language in the 911 call. He seems to reference other people. He seems to be hiding or running. And his truck was found in a position that some have said looked like it had been pushed or moved off the road rather than simply parked. A third theory, raised by some members of Brandon's own family, is that Brandon may have witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see. The area around Bronte and Coke County has significant oil field activity, and some have speculated, though without direct evidence, that Brandon may have stumbled upon illegal activity, drug manufacturing, illegal dumping, something that someone wanted to keep hidden. There is also a deeply personal dimension to this case. In the years following Brandon's disappearance, LaDessa publicly acknowledged that Brandon had been struggling with substance use around the time he vanished. Some investigators believe this is a critical piece of context. that whatever Brandon experienced that night may have been filtered through the lens of someone who was not in a fully clear state of mind. This doesn't diminish the tragedy, but it adds a layer of complexity to interpreting the 911 call and his behavior. What we know for certain is this: Brandon Lawson left San Angelo at approximately 11:30 on the night of August 8th, 2013. He drove north. His truck ran out of gas near Bronte. He called Ledessa. He called 911. He sounded scared, and by the time anyone arrived to help him, he was gone. His truck was there. His wallet was there. But Brandon was not. In the decade since his disappearance, search efforts have continued, though they have been limited by the sheer size and difficulty of the terrain. In 2022, renewed interest in the case, driven in part by online communities and podcasts, led to new search operations in the area. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Drones were used to scan the landscape from above. Some personal items were reportedly recovered, though official details remain limited. Then, in February of 2022, Ledessa Lofton confirmed publicly that skeletal remains had been found in Coke County. In early 2023, those remains were officially identified as belonging to Brandon Lawson. He was found in a rural area not far from where his truck had been abandoned, in the ranchland among the brush and the thorns. The discovery of Brandon's remains brought some measure of closure to his family, but it did not answer the central questions. How did he get there? Was he alone? Did he die of exposure? Or did something else happen? The official cause of death has not been publicly released as of the time of this recording, and the 911 call, that haunting, garbled, desperate recording, remains as mysterious as ever. What was Brandon trying to say? Who or what did he run into on that dark highway and in those final moments? Was anyone listening? Some nights, when the wind blows across that stretch of Highway 277, the only sound is the hum of power lines and the distant rumble of oil rigs. No one is out there. No one would hear a thing. Let that settle. Breathe slowly, and when you're ready, we'll continue with our next story. Story 3. The Silence of Sneha and Philip. Our third story tonight takes us to New York City, to the island of Manhattan, to a morning that changed the world forever. But this is not the story you've heard before. This is not about the towers or the heroes or the politics that followed. This is the story of one woman, a woman who disappeared into the chaos of September 11th, 2001, and whose fate remains one of the most quietly haunting mysteries to emerge from that day. Her name was Sneha Ann Phillip. She was 31 years old. She was a doctor, a first-year resident in internal medicine at Cabrini Medical Center in Lower Manhattan. She was born in India, raised in a loving family, and had come to the United States to pursue her dream of practicing medicine. By all accounts, Sneha was intelligent, warm, and dedicated. She had graduated from medical school and was working long, grueling hours as a new resident. She was recently married to a man named Ron Lieberman, a fellow physician. The couple lived together in an apartment at 2 Rector Street, a residential building located just 1 block south of the World Trade Center. 1 block. Remember that detail. It will matter. To understand Sneha's disappearance, we need to go back to the day before, September 10th, 2001, a Monday. Sneha had the day off from the hospital. According to her husband, Ron, she told him she planned to spend the day shopping and running errands. Ron left for work that morning and expected to see Sneha when he returned home that evening. He didn't. When Ron came home to their apartment that night, Sneha wasn't there. He wasn't immediately alarmed. Sometimes she stayed out late, visited friends, or went to events. He called her cell phone. No answer. He waited. Hours passed. She didn't come home. Now, this is where things get complicated. Ron would later admit that he and Sneha had been going through a difficult period in their marriage. There were tensions. There were things about Sneha's personal life that Ron was only beginning to understand. Things that, after her disappearance, would become the subject of intense scrutiny and, in some cases, unfair judgment. But we'll return to that. The next morning, September 11th, Ron still hadn't heard from Sneha. He was worried, but not yet panicked. He got ready for work. And then, at 8:46 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The South Tower was hit 17 minutes later. Ron's apartment at 2 Rector Street was engulfed in dust and debris. The area was evacuated. In the chaos, Ron fled the building and spent hours trying to reach Sneha by phone. He couldn't. In the days that followed, as the city reeled from the worst terrorist attack in American history, Ron filed a missing persons report for Sneha. But her case immediately posed a unique and troubling question, one that investigators, her family, and the courts would wrestle with for years to come. Did Sneha die in the attacks on the World Trade Center, or did she disappear the day before, on September 10th? The significance of this question cannot be overstated. If Sneha was a victim of the September 11th attacks, her name would be added to the official list of victims, and her family would be entitled to compensation from the federal September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. If she disappeared on September 10th for reasons unrelated to the attacks, then she was simply a missing person, and her case would be treated very differently. Her family believed, firmly and passionately, that Sneha had been in the area on the morning of September 11th, and that she had rushed toward the towers to help, as many doctors and first responders did that day. They believed she died a hero. The city of New York was not so sure. Let's look at what the evidence tells us. On September 10th, security camera footage from a Century 21 department store located near the World Trade Center captured a woman who appeared to be Sneha shopping in the store at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening. She appeared to be alone. She purchased several items, including bed sheets and lingerie. She seemed calm, unhurried. That footage is the last confirmed sighting of Sneha Ann Phillip. After that, nothing. No credit card transactions, no cell phone activity, no confirmed witness sightings, no footage of her entering her apartment building, no footage of her leaving it, no trace of her anywhere on the morning of September 11th. Her apartment building's security cameras were not functioning at the time, a detail that would prove agonizingly important. Investigators began to look more deeply into Sneha's personal life, hoping to find clues, and what they found painted a picture that was far more complex than anyone had initially realized. Sneha had been struggling. Professionally, she was facing disciplinary issues at Cabrini Medical Center. There had been complaints. There had been concerns about her performance. She had been placed on a kind of probation, and there was a possibility she could lose her residency. Personally, Sneha was living a complicated double life. According to friends and acquaintances who came forward after her disappearance, Sneha had been spending time in bars and clubs in the East Village and Greenwich Village. She had been meeting women. She had been exploring her sexuality in a way that she had not shared openly with her husband. Friends described Sneha as someone who was generous and outgoing in social settings, but who carried a deep sadness. She was under enormous pressure from her career, from her marriage, from cultural expectations within her family, and from the internal conflict of living a life that didn't fully reflect who she was. This personal history became a central and deeply controversial part of the investigation. Some investigators theorized that Sneha had met someone on the night of September 10th, gone to their home or a hotel, and that something had happened to her, an accident, foul play, or a voluntary decision to disappear. In this scenario, the attacks on September 11th were simply a coincidence of terrible timing that made it nearly impossible to investigate her case properly. Others, including Sneha's family, rejected this theory entirely. They argued that Sneha was a doctor. She lived 1 block from the World Trade Center. When the first plane hit, the natural instinct of any physician would be to rush toward the scene to help. Her mother, Anne Sue Phillip, would later say that Sneha would never have stood by and watched people suffer without trying to do something. In this version of events, Sneha was home that morning. She saw the attack from her window or from the street. She ran toward the towers, and she was killed, either by falling debris, the collapse of the buildings, or in the chaos that followed. The legal battle over Sneha's status lasted years. In 2004, a judge ruled that there was insufficient evidence to conclude that Sneha had died in the September 11th attacks. Her name was not added to the official list of victims. Her family was devastated. They appealed. In 2008, after a prolonged and emotionally wrenching legal process, a second court reversed the decision. The judge in the appeal ruled that it was more likely than not that Sneha had been home on the morning of September 11th, and that, given her proximity to the World Trade Center and her training as a physician, it was reasonable to conclude that she had gone to help and had perished in the collapse. Sneha Ann Phillip's name was added to the official list of September 11th victims, but the questions didn't stop. The truth is, no one knows what happened to Sneha between approximately 7 o'clock on the evening of September 10th and the collapse of the towers on the morning of September 11th. That gap, roughly 14 hours, remains a black hole. Did she go home that night? Did she stay with someone? Did she walk the streets of Lower Manhattan in the early morning hours, trying to sort through the turmoil in her life? Did she see the first plane hit from her apartment window? Did she grab her medical bag and run? There are no cameras, no witnesses, no phone records, no journal entries, no goodbye notes, no final messages, just silence. What makes Sneha's case so profoundly affecting is not just the mystery of her disappearance. It's the way her personal struggles were laid bare after she was gone. In life, she carried her secrets carefully. In death or in absence, they were pulled apart by investigators, lawyers, and the media. Her family fought to protect her memory. Her mother gave interviews for years, insisting that Sneha was a hero. Her brother created a foundation in her name. They wanted the world to remember her, not for the tabloid headlines, but for the compassion she showed her patients, the warmth she brought to her friendships, and the courage it took to live in the space between who she was expected to be and who she truly was. No physical remains of Sneha and Philip were ever recovered from the World Trade Center site. This is not unusual. More than 1,000 victims of the September 11th attacks were never identified through remains. The destruction was simply too complete. But the absence of remains means there is no definitive proof. There is no DNA match. No personal belonging recovered from the rubble. No eyewitness who saw her that morning. Just a woman who walked into a department store on a Monday evening and then was never seen again. Sometimes the loudest tragedies drown out the quieter ones. On a day when nearly 3,000 people lost their lives, one woman's story slipped through the cracks, not because it didn't matter, but because the noise was so overwhelming that her silence was simply absorbed. Sneha and Philip may have died a hero, running toward the burning towers with the instinct of a healer, or she may have vanished into the night for reasons we will never fully understand. The truth may lie somewhere in between, in a space that is neither simple nor comfortable. What we know is this: she was a daughter, a wife, a doctor, and a woman still discovering who she was. She deserved more time. She deserved more answers. And wherever she is, she deserved to be heard. Rest with that thought for a moment. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day begin to lift. We'll return shortly with our next story. Story 4, The Lonely Death of Joyce Vincent. Our fourth story tonight is unlike the others. There is no highway, no storm, no burning towers. There is only an apartment, a small, modest apartment in North London, where a television flickered in the corner of a living room for more than 2 years, while no one came to check. This is the story of Joyce Vincent, and it may be the loneliest story you will ever hear. Joyce Carol Vincent was born on October 19th, 1965, in Hammersmith, West London. She was the youngest of 5 daughters in a family of Afro-Caribbean descent. Her father, Vincent, was from Grenada and worked as a carpenter. Her mother, Jessie, was a homemaker. By all accounts, the family was modest but loving. But when Joyce was just 11 years old, her mother died. The loss was devastating, not only for Joyce, but for the entire family. In the years that followed, the household began to fracture. Joyce's father remarried, and the relationship between the sisters and their new stepmother was strained. One by one, the sisters left home. Joyce, the youngest, felt the absence of her mother most acutely. Friends who knew her in later years would describe a woman who rarely spoke about her childhood, who kept the deepest parts of herself carefully hidden, and who had learned very early on that the safest thing to do with pain was to carry it quietly. As a young woman, Joyce was by all accounts vibrant, social, and strikingly beautiful. She had a wide smile, an infectious laugh, and a presence that people remembered. She worked a series of jobs in London, in offices, in finance, in corporate settings. She was intelligent and capable. Colleagues described her as well-dressed, articulate, and professional. She had an active social life. She went to concerts. She dated. She had a wide circle of acquaintances. At one point, she reportedly met Nelson Mandela at a concert event and was photographed with him. She was, by external appearances, a woman who was living a full and connected life in one of the biggest cities in the world. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. Over the course of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, Joyce's life began to quietly unravel. The details are not entirely clear, and that in itself is part of the tragedy. No one has a complete picture, but fragments emerged later. She had been in at least one abusive relationship. She had sought help from domestic violence organizations. She had moved multiple times, sometimes suddenly, sometimes without telling people where she was going. She had changed her phone number. She had distanced herself from friends and family members, not out of anger, but out of something that looked more like shame or fear or a deep, exhausted desire to simply disappear. By 2001, Joyce had been placed in a bedsit, a small, government-assisted apartment in the Wood Green area of North London, above a shopping center called the Shopping City Mall. The apartment was provided through a housing association, likely in connection with her status as a domestic violence survivor seeking safe accommodation. It was a far cry from the social life she had once led. The apartment was small. The building was unremarkable. The neighborhood was busy but anonymous. The kind of place where people passed each other on the stairs without making eye contact. Joyce's family knew she had moved, but they didn't have her exact address. Her friends from earlier years had largely lost touch with her. Some had tried to call, but her number had changed. Some had tried to visit old addresses, but she had moved on. One by one, the threads that connected Joyce to the people who cared about her had been cut, some by circumstance, some by choice, some by the slow, invisible erosion that happens when someone is struggling and no one quite knows how to reach them. The last confirmed contact anyone had with Joyce Vincent was in December of 2003. The exact date is uncertain. Some accounts suggest she was last seen alive around the time she was wrapping Christmas presents in her apartment. Others suggest her last known activity was in early December. What is known is that at some point in late 2003, Joyce died alone in her apartment, sitting on her sofa with the television still on and Christmas presents partially wrapped on the floor beside her. No one noticed, not the neighbors, not the housing association, not her family, not her friends, not the utility companies, not the mailman, not a single person in the entire city of London. The television continued to play. The lights in the apartment stayed on, powered by a pay-as-you-go electricity meter that had been topped up with enough credit to last. The mail piled up behind the door. Bills went unpaid. Letters from the housing association that went unanswered. And Joyce sat there, on her sofa, in front of the flickering television screen, for more than 2 years. It was not until January of 2006, January 25th to be precise, that housing officials finally entered the apartment. They had come to investigate unpaid rent. When they opened the door, they were met with a scene that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Joyce's remains were found on the sofa. She had been dead for approximately 2 years and 2 months. Her body had decomposed to the point where identification was difficult. The television was still on. The heating had been running. The Christmas presents were still on the floor. Think about that for a moment. 2 years and 2 months in a city of 8 million people, in an apartment building where other people lived just feet away, separated by thin walls and shared hallways. No one knocked on her door. No one reported a smell. No one wondered why they hadn't seen her. How is that possible? The coroner was unable to determine a definitive cause of death. Joyce's remains were too decomposed for a conclusive autopsy. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no evidence of foul play. The most likely explanations were natural causes, perhaps an asthma attack, as Joyce was known to suffer from asthma, or possibly a complication related to a peptic ulcer, which she had also been treated for in the past. She was 38 years old. The discovery of Joyce's body made headlines in the United Kingdom, not because of the manner of her death, which was likely mundane, medically speaking, but because of what it revealed about modern life, about urban isolation, about the way a person can exist in the middle of a crowded city and yet be utterly, completely, invisibly alone. How does a woman with a wide social circle, a work history, a family of 4 sisters, and a life that had once been full of music and laughter and connection, end up dead on a sofa for 2 years without anyone knowing? The answer, of course, is not simple. It is not one thing. It is 100 small things accumulating over years. It is the domestic abuse that made her move without telling anyone. It is the shame that made her withdraw from her sisters. It is the phone number that changed one too many times. It is the pride that kept her from asking for help. It is the housing system that placed her in an anonymous bedsit and then failed to check on her. It is the neighbors who heard the television through the wall and assumed she was fine. It is the friends who meant to call but never did. It is the city itself, vast, fast, indifferent, where a person can live and die within earshot of 1 million people and never be heard. In 2011, a British filmmaker named Carol Morley released a documentary about Joyce's life. It was called Dreams of a Life. Morley had read about Joyce's case in a newspaper and had been haunted by it. She spent years tracking down people who had known Joyce, former colleagues, ex-boyfriends, friends from her social days, and asking them the same question: how did this happen? The people she found were almost without exception shocked. They remembered Joyce as lively, as beautiful, as someone who lit up a room. Several of them broke down in tears during interviews. They couldn't understand how the vibrant woman they had known could have ended up so alone. But as the documentary unfolds, a pattern emerges. Almost every person Morley interviewed had lost touch with Joyce at some point. Almost every one of them had a moment where they thought about calling or visiting and didn't. Almost every one of them assumed someone else was looking after her, and no one was. One of the most painful details to emerge from the documentary is that Joyce had been receiving mail and bills throughout the 2 years she lay undiscovered. The housing association had sent letters about unpaid rent. Utility companies had sent notices. At least one letter was reportedly slid under her door. But no one followed up in person. No one made a physical check. The system, designed to manage thousands of tenants across hundreds of properties, simply flagged her account as delinquent and moved on. Joyce's sisters eventually came forward after the documentary brought renewed attention to the case. They expressed deep grief and deep guilt. They had not known where Joyce was living. They had not known she was in trouble. The family's fragmentation, which had begun with their mother's death decades earlier, had created distances that none of them had been able to bridge. One of her sisters would later say that Joyce had always been the one who seemed like she was doing fine. She was the one who smiled. She was the one who didn't ask for help. And because she never asked, no one thought to offer. Joyce Vincent was eventually laid to rest. A small funeral was held. Her remains were identified through dental records and medical history. The Christmas presents she had been wrapping, no one knows who they were for. No one knows what was inside them. There is a tendency, when we hear stories like this, to think of them as aberrations, as tragic anomalies, as something that could never happen to us, or to someone we know. But the truth is, Joyce Vincent's story is not as rare as we would like to believe. In cities around the world, people die alone in their homes and are not discovered for weeks, months, sometimes years. In Japan, the phenomenon is so common, it has a name, kodakushi, or lonely death. In the United Kingdom, studies have found that hundreds of thousands of elderly people go an entire week without speaking to a single person. But Joyce was not elderly. She was 38. She was not forgotten because she was old or infirm. She was forgotten because the world moved on without her, and she let it. Or perhaps the world let her. What stays with you long after you've heard this story is not the horror of the discovery. It's not the image of the apartment or the television screen. It's something quieter than that. It's the thought of those Christmas presents on the floor, partially wrapped, intended for someone. Proof that even in her loneliest moment, Joyce was thinking of other people. She was thinking of connection, of giving, of reaching out. She just never got the chance to finish. Let yourself be still for a moment. Let the silence be gentle. You are here. You are not alone. And when you're ready, we have one more story to share with you tonight. Story 5, The Boy in the Box. Our final story tonight is the oldest of the 5. It begins not with a name, but with the absence of one. Because for 65 years, no one knew who this child was. No one claimed him. No one came looking. He was found in a cardboard box on the side of a road, and for decades, he was known only as the boy in the box. This is the story of America's unknown child. On February 25th, 1957, a young man in his early 20s was driving along Susquehanna Road in the Fox Chase neighborhood of Northeast Philadelphia. It was a quiet, semi-rural area at the time, patches of woodland between modest homes and open lots. The road ran alongside a stretch of overgrown land that bordered a facility called the Good Shepherd Home, which served as a school and residence for girls. The young man, a college student who was checking on his animal traps in the area, noticed something off the road. partially hidden in the underbrush. It was a large cardboard box, a J.C. Penney bassinet box, the kind used to package a baby's cradle. He walked over to it. He looked inside, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside the box was the body of a small boy. He appeared to be between 4 and 6 years old. He was naked, wrapped in a cheap plaid flannel blanket. His body showed signs of severe malnourishment. His hair had been crudely cut. Recently, it appeared, and clumps of it still clung to his body. There were bruises on his head and body. His fingernails and toenails were neatly trimmed. His eyes were blue. He was dead. The young man who found the box did not immediately call the police. He was afraid. He had been in the area checking muskrat traps, which he may not have had a license for, and he didn't want to draw attention to himself. So he left. He went home. He told no one. A few days later, another person driving through the same area spotted the box and also looked inside. He too was horrified, and he too hesitated. But eventually, word reached the authorities. On February 26, 1957, Philadelphia police arrived at the scene and recovered the boy's body. He was transported to the city morgue, where he was examined, photographed, and fingerprinted. And that was where the first and most devastating mystery began. No one knew who he was. The Philadelphia Police Department launched what would become one of the most extensive investigations in the city's history. The boy's photograph was distributed to newspapers, schools, hospitals, and social service agencies throughout the region. His fingerprints were run against every available database. Flyers were posted on utility poles and in shop windows across Philadelphia and the surrounding counties. The investigators printed over 400,000 flyers featuring the boy's photograph and description. They were inserted into every gas and electric bill in the greater Philadelphia area. Hundreds of thousands of people saw that photograph. The face of a small boy with blue eyes and a fresh haircut, lying as if asleep, wrapped in a plaid blanket. And not a single person came forward to identify him. Not a parent, not a relative, not a neighbor, not a teacher, not a babysitter, not a doctor. Not a single human being in the entire city of Philadelphia or anywhere else said, "I know that child." How does a child exist in the world for 4, 5, maybe 6 years and leave no trace? No birth certificate that anyone could match, no school enrollment, no medical records, no photographs in anyone's family album. It was as though this boy had been invisible his entire short life, as though he had existed in a space between the cracks, seen by no one, known by no one, missed by no one. That absence, that silence, is what made this case so deeply disturbing to the detectives who worked it. They had investigated murders before. They had seen terrible things, but they had never encountered a victim who simply didn't exist in any system, in any record, in any memory. The medical examiner's report provided some clues, though none of them led anywhere definitive. The boy was white, approximately 4 to 6 years old, with light brown hair that had been cut very recently, likely within hours of his death. He weighed approximately 30 pounds, which was significantly underweight for his age. His body showed evidence of chronic malnourishment. There were bruises on his forehead, his face, and his body, consistent with blunt force trauma. The cause of death was determined to be homicide by blunt force injury to the head. Someone had beaten this child to death. The blanket he was wrapped in was traced to a manufacturer, but it was a common, mass-produced item sold in stores throughout the region. The J.C. Penney box was similarly untraceable. It could have come from any of hundreds of stores. Investigators followed every lead they could find. They checked every reported missing child in the region. They interviewed residents of the Fox Chase neighborhood. They canvassed the Good Shepherd home, interviewing staff and students. They checked orphanages, foster homes, hospitals, and churches. They contacted police departments in neighboring states. Nothing. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. The case went cold. The boy was buried in a potter's field in Philadelphia, a cemetery for the unidentified and unclaimed. A small headstone was placed at his grave. It read simply, "America's Unknown Child." But the case was never forgotten, not by the detectives who had worked it, not by the medical examiner who had performed the autopsy, and not by a dedicated group of volunteers who, over the decades, would keep the boy's memory alive and push for answers. In 1998, more than 40 years after the boy's death, his body was exhumed so that a DNA sample could be collected. The hope was that advancing forensic technology might one day make it possible to identify him. His remains were then reburied in a new location, Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, with a proper headstone and a new inscription, "America's Unknown Child." A group called the VDOC Society, a Philadelphia-based organization of forensic professionals who investigate cold cases, took an active interest in the case. They re-examined the evidence. They consulted with forensic artists who created updated renderings of what the boy might have looked like in life. They pursued tips that had come in over the years. One of the most compelling tips came from a woman identified only as Martha, a pseudonym used to protect her identity. Martha came forward in 2002 and told investigators a detailed story. She claimed that the boy had been purchased by her mother from his birth parents in the early 1950s. She said that her mother, who ran a household that was physically and emotionally abusive, had kept the boy in the home, where he was subjected to years of horrific neglect and violence. Martha claimed that on the night of his death, the boy had vomited in the bathtub after being forced to eat baked beans, a food he couldn't tolerate, and that her mother had flown into a rage and beaten him until he died. She said her mother then cut the boy's hair to disguise him, wrapped him in a blanket, and placed him in the box on the side of the road. Martha's account was chilling and specific, but investigators were unable to corroborate key parts of her story. Some details matched the physical evidence, others did not. Martha herself had a complicated history, and her credibility was questioned. The case remained officially unsolved. But the story doesn't end there. In November of 2019, the Philadelphia Police Department and the FBI submitted the boy's DNA to a genealogical database using a technique called investigative genetic genealogy, the same technology that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer the year before. The process involves comparing DNA profiles against public genealogical databases to find potential relatives, and then building family trees to narrow down the identity of an unknown individual. It took years, Genealogists and investigators worked painstakingly, tracing family lines across states and decades. They followed branches of family trees that led to dead ends. They started over. They tried again. And then, on December 8th, 2022, 65 years after the boy was found, the Philadelphia Police Department held a press conference. The room was full of reporters, investigators, and members of the Vidocq Society who had spent decades working the case. The police commissioner stepped up to the microphone and announced that the boy in the box had finally been identified. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He had been born on January 13th, 1953, in Philadelphia. He was 4 years old when he died. The room fell silent. Then there were tears. 65 years. 65 years of silence. And finally, someone spoke his name. The details that emerged after the identification were sparse but significant. Joseph's birth parents were identified, and investigators confirmed that he had been born in the city and had lived in the area. The circumstances of his early life, how he came to be in the situation that led to his death, remain partially unclear. Some details have been withheld by investigators who indicated that the case was still an active homicide investigation. Both of Joseph's birth parents are deceased. No one has been charged with his murder. Given the passage of time, it is likely that whoever killed him is also dead. But his name, that small, sacred thing that was taken from him for 65 years, was finally returned. After the identification, Joseph's headstone at Ivy Hill Cemetery was updated. Where it once read, America's Unknown Child, it now bears his name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born January 13th, 1953, found February 25th, 1957. People still visit the grave. They leave flowers. They leave stuffed animals. They leave notes. Some of them are from people who have followed the case for decades. Some are from people who only just heard the story, but they all come for the same reason: to stand in the presence of a child who was failed by every adult in his life and to say, I see you. I know your name. You are not forgotten. There is something about this case that reaches deeper than most. Perhaps it is because the victim was a child, small, defenseless, dependent on the very people who harmed him. Perhaps it is because of the anonymity, the idea that a human being could live and die and be buried without anyone knowing his name. Perhaps it is because of the 65 years it took to give him back the most basic element of identity. Or perhaps it is because this story asks us a question we are not comfortable answering. How many children are invisible? How many are living right now in homes where no one outside knows they exist? How many are not enrolled in school, not registered with a doctor, not known to a single neighbor? How many of them are suffering in silence, behind closed doors, in a world that assumes someone else is paying attention? Joseph Augustus Zarelli was one of them. For 4 short years, he lived in this world, and for 65 years after that, the world didn't even know his name. But now we do. Rest with that for a moment. Hold that name gently. Joseph, a boy who deserved so much more. A boy who at long last was heard. And with that, we come to the end of tonight's stories. 5 cases, 5 lives, 5 moments where someone vanished into silence, where cries for help were swallowed by darkness, distance, chaos, loneliness, or indifference. Asha Degree walking into a storm on a Valentine's night. Brandon Lawson calling for help on an empty highway. Sneha Ann Phillip disappearing into the shadow of a tragedy far larger than her own. Joyce Vincent sitting in her apartment while the world moved on without her. And Joseph Zarelli, a little boy who waited 65 years just to be called by his name. These stories are heavy. They are meant to be. But they are also reminders to listen more carefully, to check on the people we love, to notice the ones who have gone quiet. Because sometimes the people who need us most are the ones who never ask. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I hope these stories gave you something to think about as you drift off to sleep. Not fear, but something softer. Compassion, maybe, or gratitude, or simply the awareness that you are here, you are safe, and you are not alone. If you'd like to hear more stories like these, please subscribe to Mr. Crime and Sleep. Leave a comment if a particular story stayed with you. And if you know someone who likes to fall asleep to true crime, send them our way. Until next time, good night, sleep well, and take care of each other. I'm Ethan Satinginar. Story 6, The Springfield Three. Before we continue, take a moment to settle in a little deeper. Adjust your blanket. Close your eyes if they aren't already. Let the sound of my voice carry you forward gently into our next story. This one takes us to the American Midwest, to a college town in Missouri, to a night that began with celebration and ended with 3 women vanishing from their own home without a single trace. This is the story of the Springfield Three. Cheryl Levitt was 47 years old in June of 1992. She was a divorced mother, a cosmetologist who ran her own business, and a woman known in her community as warm, independent, and strong. She lived in a tidy home on East Delmer Street in Springfield, Missouri, a mid-sized city in the southwestern part of the state, home to several universities and a population of about 150,000 people. Cheryl's daughter, Suzanne Streeter, was 19. She had just graduated from Kickapoo High School the year before and was attending classes at Southwest Missouri State University. Suzanne was bright and social, with a wide circle of friends and a reputation as someone who was outgoing and well-liked. On the evening of June 6, 1992, Suzanne attended a series of graduation parties with her close friend Stacy McCall. Stacy was also 19. She was one of the graduates being celebrated that night. The 2 girls were inseparable. They spent the evening moving between parties, laughing, taking photographs, enjoying the warm summer night and the feeling of freedom that comes with finishing high school. The original plan was for Suzanne and Stacy to spend the night at a friend's house after the parties, but at some point during the evening, the plan changed. Instead, the 2 girls decided to go back to Suzanne's house, to Cheryl's home on East Delmer Street, to sleep there for the night. They arrived sometime in the early morning hours of June 7th. Cheryl was home. The house was quiet. The girls settled in, and then all 3 of them disappeared. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. Stacy's mother, Janice McCall, had expected Stacy to call her. When she didn't, Janice called the friend's house where the girls had originally planned to stay. They told her the girls had gone to Suzanne's house instead. So Janice drove over to East Delmar Street. She arrived at the house and found the front door unlocked. She walked inside. The house was neat. The beds appeared to have been slept in. Cheryl's small dog, a Yorkshire Terrier named Cinnamon, was inside, agitated but unharmed. The women's purses were lined up on the floor near the front entrance. Cheryl's, Suzanne's, and Stacy's. Their cars were in the driveway. Their cigarettes, their money, their identification, all still in the house. But the women were gone, all three of them, without their shoes, without their belongings, without any sign of where they had gone or why. Janice assumed at first that they had simply stepped out, gone for a walk perhaps, or driven somewhere with a friend. She waited. She called back later. Still no answer. By the afternoon, she was deeply worried. She called the Springfield Police Department. When officers arrived, they conducted a walkthrough of the home. What they found, or rather, what they didn't find, was profoundly unsettling. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors, no furniture overturned, no blood, no signs of a struggle of any kind. The house looked almost exactly as you would expect it to look on a quiet Sunday morning. Dishes in the sink, lights off, beds unmade. The only anomaly, aside from the three missing women, was the front porch light. The glass globe that covered the light fixture had been removed and placed on the ground near the front steps. It was not broken, just unscrewed and set aside. No one could explain why. There was also the answering machine. When investigators checked it, the messages had been deleted. Someone had erased the tape. Whether it was one of the women or someone else entirely has never been determined. A friend who called the house that morning reported that the answering machine had picked up normally, suggesting no one was home, or no one could answer. The police initially treated the case as a missing persons investigation rather than a criminal case. In 1992, there was a 48-hour waiting period before adults could be officially reported as missing. Some critics of the investigation have argued that this delay cost precious time during which evidence could have been collected, witnesses could have been interviewed, and the trail, whatever it was, could have been followed before it went cold. By the time the case was escalated to a full criminal investigation, days had passed. The house had been entered by multiple friends and family members. Well-meaning visitors had cleaned up, touched surfaces, and potentially contaminated the scene. The answering machine tape was gone. Whatever fragile evidence might have existed in those first critical hours had been compromised. The case quickly became the biggest story in Springfield's history. Hundreds of tips poured in. Volunteers organized search parties. Psychics offered their services. The national media picked up the story. 3 women, a mother, her daughter, and her daughter's best friend, had vanished from a locked house in the middle of a safe, middle-class neighborhood in the middle of the night without a trace. How was that possible? Over the years, investigators pursued dozens of leads and theories. One of the earliest suspects was a man named Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper and murderer who had been living in the Springfield area at the time of the disappearances. Cox had a violent history and had been convicted of the murder of a young woman in Florida in 1978. He was known to frequent the same social circles as some of the people connected to the case. When questioned, Cox made statements that some interpreted as veiled confessions. He reportedly told acquaintances that the 3 women would never be found alive. But he never formally confessed, and investigators were unable to gather enough evidence to charge him. Cox is currently in prison in Texas on an unrelated charge. Another theory centered on a man named Larry Dwayne Hall, a serial killer from Illinois who confessed to multiple abductions and murders of young women across the Midwest during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Hall's known patterns of behavior, targeting young women, operating in Missouri and surrounding states, and disposing of victims in rural areas, made him a plausible suspect. However, his connection to the Springfield Three has never been definitively established. A third theory, and one that has gained significant traction in recent years, involves a possible connection to the drug trade. Springfield, Missouri, in the early 1990s, was not immune to the methamphetamine epidemic that was sweeping through rural America. Some investigators and journalists have suggested that one or more of the women may have had peripheral connections to individuals involved in the drug trade, and that the disappearances may have been connected to a debt, a threat, or an act of retaliation. This theory remains controversial and has been firmly denied by the families. In 2007, a man came forward with a new tip. He told investigators that he believed the bodies of the 3 women had been buried under a concrete parking structure at a hospital construction site in Springfield. The tip was specific enough to generate significant media attention, and ground-penetrating radar was used to scan the area. The results were inconclusive. Some anomalies were detected beneath the concrete, but the cost of excavation, estimated at several $100,000, was deemed too high without more definitive evidence. The site has never been excavated. The families of the 3 women have spent more than 3 decades searching for answers. Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, became one of the most vocal advocates for the case, giving interviews, attending vigils, and pushing law enforcement to continue the investigation. She passed away in 2024, never having learned what happened to her daughter. Cheryl Levitt's friends and family similarly kept her memory alive, describing her as a woman who would have fought fiercely to protect her daughter and Stacy. Some have speculated that whoever took the women must have used a weapon or a threat significant enough to subdue all 3 of them, because Cheryl, by all accounts, was not someone who would have gone quietly. And that is perhaps the most haunting element of this case. 3 women, 3 adults, in their own home, in a safe neighborhood, and not a single neighbor heard a scream, a car door, a commotion of any kind. Whatever happened inside that house on East Delmar Street happened silently, efficiently, and completely. More than 30 years have passed. The house on East Delmar Street still stands. It has changed hands several times. Some owners have reported nothing unusual. Others have said they feel an unease they can't quite explain. The front porch light glowed was never explained. The deleted answering machine messages were never recovered. And Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall have never been found. 3 women walked into a house on a warm summer night. The door closed behind them, and the silence that followed has lasted more than 3 decades. Somewhere, someone knows what happened. Somewhere, there is a person or people who carry the weight of that knowledge, and perhaps, even now, the silence is beginning to crack. But for tonight, we let it rest. Breathe slowly, let your thoughts soften, and we'll move on gently to our next story. Story 7, The Keddie Cabin Murders. Our next story takes us to the mountains of Northern California, to a place that was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet, affordable community nestled among pine trees and winding roads, far from the noise and stress of city life. A place where families came to heal. Instead, it became the site of one of the most brutal and baffling unsolved murders in California history. This is the story of the Keddie Cabin Murders. Keddie was a tiny resort community in Plumas County, California, located in the Sierra Nevada foothills about 80 miles northwest of Reno, Nevada. In its early days, it had been a vacation destination, a place where city people came to fish, hike, and breathe mountain air. But by the 1970s, Keddie had changed. The resort had been converted into low-income housing, a collection of small cabins rented to families who were struggling financially. It was a place where people landed when they had nowhere else to go. In 1980, Glenna Sue Sharp, known to everyone as Sue, moved to Keddie with her 5 children. She had recently left an abusive marriage and was trying to rebuild her life. She was 36 years old, a mother of 5, and she was doing everything she could to give her children stability in a place that was far from stable. Sue and her children moved into Cabin 28, a small wooden structure with thin walls, a modest kitchen, and barely enough room for a family of 6. The cabin was rustic at best, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbor's television through the wall, where the plumbing was unreliable, and where the forest pressed in close on all sides. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Sue's children ranged in age from 5 to 15. Her eldest son, John, was 15. Her eldest daughter, Sheila, was 14. Then came Tina, 12, Rick, 10, and Greg, the youngest, at 5. On the evening of April 11th, 1981, a Saturday night, the cabin was busy. John had a friend staying over, a boy named Dana Wingate, who was 17. The 2 of them were hanging out in the back bedroom with Rick and Greg. Sheila, the eldest daughter, was spending the night at a neighboring cabin with a friend. Tina was home with Sue. Sue herself had a friend visiting, a man named Justin Smart, who lived in a nearby cabin with his wife Marilyn and their young son. Justin was a large, heavy-set man, known in the community as someone who was friendly but troubled. He and Sue were friends. The nature of their relationship has been the subject of speculation, but by most accounts, they were close. At some point during the evening, Justin left Cabin 28. What happened after that has been pieced together only through the aftermath, because by the next morning, the scene inside the cabin was one of unimaginable horror. On the morning of April 12th, Sheila Sharp returned home from her sleepover at the neighboring cabin. She walked through the front door of Cabin 28 and entered the living room. What she found is difficult to describe, and out of respect for the victims, I will not go into graphic detail. But the essential facts are these. Sue Sharp, her eldest son John, and John's friend Dana Wingate were found dead in the living room. They had been bound with medical tape and electrical cord. They had been beaten with a claw hammer. They had been stabbed with a knife, and what investigators later determined was a butter knife that had been bent and sharpened. The level of violence was extraordinary, far beyond what would have been necessary to kill them. It suggested rage. It suggested something deeply personal. Tina, the 12-year-old daughter, was not in the cabin. She was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere on the property. Remarkably, almost impossibly, Rick and Greg and Dana's younger companion were found in the back bedroom, asleep and unharmed. They had apparently slept through the entire attack. The thin walls of the cabin, the screams that must have occurred, the violence that was happening just feet away, and 3 children slept through it. Some investigators have questioned whether the children were drugged, though this was never conclusively proven. When the Plumas County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene, they were overwhelmed. Keddie was a small, rural community. The Sheriff's Department was not equipped for a case of this magnitude. The crime scene was chaotic. Multiple people had entered the cabin before law enforcement arrived. Evidence was contaminated almost immediately. In the days that followed, investigators processed the scene as best they could. They collected fingerprints, blood samples, and the weapons. The hammer, the knives, the bindings. They interviewed residents of the Keddie Resort community, many of whom were deeply shaken. The community was small. Everyone knew everyone. The idea that someone among them could have committed such an act was almost unbearable. Suspicion quickly fell on several individuals, but the investigation was plagued by problems from the beginning. The most prominent suspects were Justin Smart, Sue's friend who had visited the cabin that evening, and a man named Martin Smart, Justin's father, who also lived in the Keddie community. Martin Smart had a history of violent behavior and mental instability. He had been in and out of psychiatric facilities. He was known to carry knives, and in the weeks and months following the murders, his behavior became increasingly erratic. Martin's wife at the time, Marilyn Smart, reportedly told friends and family members that she believed Martin was involved in the killings. Years later, she would provide more detailed statements to investigators, describing incriminating behavior and statements Martin had made in the aftermath of the murders. A hammer matching the description of the murder weapon was reportedly found in a pond near the Smart residence, along with a steak knife, but no charges were ever filed. The Plumas County District Attorney at the time determined that there was insufficient evidence to bring a case to trial. The physical evidence had been poorly preserved. Key witnesses were unreliable or unwilling to testify, and the passage of time made things worse. Memories faded, people moved away, and the small-town dynamics of Keddie made it difficult to pursue leads without fracturing the community further. Martin Smart died in 2000. Justin Smart died in 2011. Neither was ever charged. And then there was Tina. For 3 years, no one knew what had happened to the 12-year-old girl who had vanished from cabin 28 on the night of the murders. Search teams had scoured the surrounding forest. Divers had searched nearby lakes and rivers. Volunteers had walked every trail within miles of Keddie. Nothing. Then, in April of 1984, a bottle collector walking in a remote area of Butte County, roughly 50 miles from Keddie, discovered a human skull in the underbrush near a dirt road called Camp Creek Road. Dental records confirmed that the skull belonged to Tina Sharp. Over the following months, additional skeletal remains were recovered from the area. The remains were scattered, likely by animals, and were in an advanced state of decomposition. The cause of Tina's death was not definitively established, but the circumstances made it clear that she had been taken from the cabin alive, transported a significant distance, and killed at a later time. The discovery of Tina's remains added a new and terrible dimension to the case. It confirmed that the attack on Cabin 28 had not been a simple act of rage. It had involved planning, at least to some degree. Someone had the presence of mind to abduct a child from the scene, transport her across county lines, and dispose of her body in a remote location. This was not a crime of pure impulse. There was calculation involved. In 2016, the Plumas County Sheriff's Department announced that it was reopening the Keddie Cabin murders investigation. New forensic techniques, including advanced DNA analysis, were being applied to evidence that had been in storage for 35 years. The department worked with the FBI and the California Department of Justice. In the years since, some developments have been reported. Sealed search warrants were executed, new interviews were conducted, and DNA profiles were developed from evidence at the scene. But, as of today, no new arrests have been made. The case remains officially open, but unsolved. The cabin itself, Cabin 28, stood for decades as a silent monument to the tragedy. It was eventually condemned and demolished in 2004. The land where it stood is now an empty lot, overgrown with grass and wildflowers. If you didn't know what had happened there, you would never guess. It looks like any other patch of cleared land in the mountains, but the people of Keddie know, and the families of Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina Sharp have never stopped waiting for justice. What haunts investigators most about this case is not the violence, though the violence was extreme. It is the silence. It is the fact that in a community of small cabins with thin walls, where everyone could hear everything, a family was slaughtered in the night and no one reported hearing a sound. It is the fact that a 12-year-old girl was taken from her home and carried away into the darkness, and no one saw a thing. It is the silence of a community that may have known more than it ever said. The silence of suspects who took their secrets to the grave, and the silence of a mountain forest that swallowed a little girl and held her for 3 years before giving back only her bones. Some silences are natural, some are chosen, and some are enforced by fear, by complicity, or by the understanding that certain truths, once spoken, can never be taken back. Keddie is quiet now. The resort cabins are mostly gone. The mountains remain, and somewhere in those mountains, in the soil, in the trees, in the wind that moves through the pines at night, the echoes of that April evening still linger. Let those echoes fade now. Let the story settle into something soft and distant. Breathe in slowly, breathe out. We have one more story to share with you tonight. It's the story 8, The Disappearance of Maura Murray. Our final story tonight takes us to the White Mountains of New Hampshire, to a dark stretch of road surrounded by snow-covered trees, to a car that crashed into a snowbank, and to a young woman who stepped out into the cold February night and was never seen again. This is the story of Maura Murray. Maura was 21 years old in February of 2004. She was a nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She was athletic, a former track star at West Point, where she had initially enrolled before transferring to UMass. She was the daughter of Fred Murray, a devoted father who would later dedicate his life to finding her, and Lori Murray, from whom Fred was separated. Maura had an older brother and 2 sisters. By all outward appearances, she was a bright, driven young woman with her whole life ahead of her. But in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, something was off. On the evening of February 5th, 2004, just 4 days before she vanished, Maura was working a security shift at her dormitory when she received a phone call that left her visibly upset. A colleague who was with her that night said Maura became so distressed that she was nearly catatonic, staring ahead, unresponsive, tears running down her face. The source and content of that phone call have never been definitively identified. Maura told her supervisor she was fine and she left her shift early. The following day, February 6th, Maura was involved in a single-car accident in Hadley, Massachusetts. She had been driving her father's new car, a Toyota Corolla he had lent her for the weekend, and she hit a guardrail. The car sustained significant damage, but Maura was uninjured. Police responded. Maura was cooperative, but reportedly smelled of alcohol. No charges were filed. Her father, Fred, came to help deal with the damaged car. He and Maura spent time together that weekend, looking at used cars, and by all accounts, their interaction was normal and warm. Fred would later describe nothing unusual about Maura's behavior during that visit, but behind the scenes, things were more complicated. Maura had recently had a minor incident involving a stolen credit card. She had used someone else's card number to order food delivery. She had been cited for the infraction, but had not yet faced formal consequences. She was also reportedly struggling academically, though the extent of this has been debated. On February 9th, 2004, a Monday, Maura did something unexpected. She emailed her professors and her workplace, telling them she would be absent for a week due to a death in the family. There had been no death in the family. She had fabricated the excuse. She then searched MapQuest for directions to the Berkshires and Burlington, Vermont. She packed her car, her own Saturn, not her father's damaged Toyota, with clothes, toiletries, textbooks, and personal items. She also brought a significant amount of alcohol, several bottles of liquor that she had purchased at a local store, and then she drove north. No one knows exactly why. She didn't tell her boyfriend, Bill Rauch, who was stationed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. She didn't tell her father. She didn't tell her sisters or her friends. She simply packed her car and drove into the mountains of New Hampshire alone on a cold Monday afternoon in February at approximately 7:27 in the evening. Maura's black 1996 Saturn sedan crashed into a snowbank on Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire, a winding rural road in the White Mountains region known as Wild Ammonoosuc Road. The road is remote. In February, at that hour, it would have been completely dark. The temperature was well below freezing. A local resident named Butch Atwood witnessed the aftermath. Atwood was a school bus driver who lived nearby. He saw Maura's car wedged into the snowbank, its airbags deployed, and pulled over to help. He spoke to Maura through her window. He would later describe her as shaken but coherent. She told him she had already called AAA, and that help was on the way. Atwood offered to call the police. Maura declined, firmly. She said she was fine. She asked him not to call. Atwood, sensing something was off but not wanting to force the issue, drove to his house, which was within sight of Maura's car, and called 911 from his landline. When police arrived approximately 7 to 9 minutes later, the car was still there. The doors were locked. Maura's personal belongings were inside: her textbooks, her packed clothes, her toiletries. A rag had been stuffed into the tailpipe, which some believe was an amateur attempt to address an exhaust problem the car had been having. A box of wine had been opened and appeared to have spilled inside the vehicle. Her cell phone, debit card, and most of her personal items were with the car, but Maura was gone. She had vanished in the span of 7 to 9 minutes, on a freezing night, on a dark mountain road, with no other cars reported in the area. The search that followed was extensive. New Hampshire fish and game officers, state police, local volunteers, and eventually the FBI all participated. Tracking dogs were brought in. Helicopters surveyed the area from above. Search teams combed the surrounding woods, which were dense, snow-covered, and treacherous. The dogs tracked Maura's scent from the crash site eastward along Route 112 for approximately 100 feet. Then the scent stopped. It did not continue into the woods. It did not turn down a side road. It simply ended, as though Maura had gotten into a vehicle. This detail has become the single most debated piece of evidence in the case. If the scent trail ended at the road, it could mean that Maura got into a car, either willingly with someone she knew or flagged down, or unwillingly taken by someone who happened upon her at the worst possible moment. It could also mean that the cold, the wind, or the conditions interfered with the dog's ability to track. The two dominant theories have divided Maura's followers, and there are many of them, as this case has generated one of the most active and dedicated online communities in the history of true crime. The first theory is that Maura succumbed to the elements. In this scenario, she left the crash site on foot, possibly intoxicated, and wandered into the woods to avoid police. Perhaps because she had been drinking and was worried about a DUI charge, especially given the recent accident with her father's car. Disoriented, cold, and impaired, she walked deeper into the forest than she realized. Hypothermia set in. She sat down. She fell asleep, and she died. This theory is plausible. Death from exposure is not uncommon in the White Mountains, even among experienced hikers. The terrain is rugged, and in February, the cold is deadly. But it has a significant problem. Despite extensive searches over more than 20 years, Maura's body has never been found. Not a single bone. not a scrap of clothing, not a shoe, nothing. The woods around Route 112 have been searched dozens of times by professional teams with trained dogs, and the forest has yielded nothing. Some argue that the terrain is so vast and so dense that a body could lie undiscovered for decades. Others counter that decomposition, animal activity, and seasonal changes would have exposed something by now. A bone fragment, a piece of fabric, something. The second theory is that Maura encountered foul play. In this scenario, someone, a passing motorist, a local resident, a stranger, came upon Maura in the minutes between Butch Atwood's departure and the arrival of police. That person offered her a ride or took her by force, and she was never seen again. This theory is supported by the abrupt end of the scent trail and the extremely narrow time window in which Maura disappeared. It is also supported by the fact that no trace of her has ever been found in the surrounding wilderness. But it has its own problems. No suspicious vehicles were reported in the area that night. No witnesses saw anyone stop at the scene. No evidence of a struggle was found at or near the car, and no suspect has ever been identified. Over the years, Maura's father, Fred Murray, has become the case's most tireless advocate. He has traveled to New Hampshire hundreds of times. He has searched the woods himself. He has hired private investigators. He has given countless interviews. He has clashed publicly with law enforcement over what he perceives as a lack of urgency and transparency in the investigation. He has never stopped looking for his daughter. Fred Murray believes Maura met with foul play. He has said so publicly, repeatedly, and with the conviction of a father who knows his daughter would have found a way to come home if she could. Maura's boyfriend at the time, Bill Rauch, was investigated and cleared as a suspect. He was in Oklahoma on the night of her disappearance. But the relationship between Maura's family and Bill became strained over the years, and the personal dynamics surrounding the case have added layers of complexity and pain to an already agonizing situation. In the 2 decades since Maura's disappearance, the case has been the subject of multiple books, a television series on the Oxygen Network, several podcasts, and thousands of blog posts and forum discussions. Amateur investigators have pored over every detail: the phone call that upset her, the email to her professors, the alcohol in the car, the rag in the tailpipe, the 7-minute window, the scent trail that ended at the road. Some believe Maura planned to disappear, that she was overwhelmed by the accumulating stress of the credit card incident, the car accident, and her academic struggles, and that she drove to New Hampshire to start over. This theory suggests she is alive somewhere, living under a different name, but there is no evidence to support this. No confirmed sighting, no financial activity, no contact with any family member or friend in over 20 years. In the age of digital surveillance, social media, and interconnected databases, disappearing completely is almost impossibly difficult. And Maura was 21, young, without significant resources, and in the middle of a New Hampshire winter. The most honest answer, the one that investigators, journalists, and family members have all eventually arrived at, is that we don't know. We don't know why Maura drove to New Hampshire. We don't know what happened in those 7 minutes. We don't know where she is. What we know is that on a cold February night, a young woman stood on a dark road in the mountains, with snow on the ground and stars overhead, and the world closed around her like a curtain. When it opened again, she was gone. Route 112 is still there. The snowbanks still form in winter. The trees still stand silent and tall, watching the road with the patience of things that have seen everything and remember nothing. And Fred Murray still drives to New Hampshire, still walks those woods, still believes that one day he will bring his daughter home. Some stories don't have endings. Some stories just have silence and the people who refuse to accept it. This is one of those stories, and with that, we come to the end of tonight's journey. 8 stories, 8 lives, 8 moments where someone slipped into silence and the world struggled to hear them. Asha Degree, a child walking into a storm. Brandon Lawson calling for help on an empty highway. Sneha and Philip, lost in the shadow of a day the world will never forget. Joyce Vincent, alone in a city of millions. Joseph Zarelli, a boy who waited 65 years for his name. The Springfield Three, vanishing from their own living room. The family in cabin 28, taken in the night while children slept in the next room. And Maura Murray, stepping away from a crashed car into the cold mountain dark. These stories are heavy. They are meant to be. But I hope they are also something else. I hope they are a reminder to listen more carefully, to check on the people we love, to notice when someone goes quiet, because sometimes the people who need us most are the ones who never ask. Thank you for spending this evening with me. I hope these stories gave you something to carry into sleep. Not fear, but something gentler. Compassion, gratitude, or simply the quiet awareness that you are here, you are safe, and you are not alone. If these stories stayed with you, please subscribe to Mr. Crime and Sleep and leave a comment with the story that touched you most. If you know someone who likes to fall asleep to true crime, send them our way. We'll be here, waiting in the dark, with another story to tell. Until next time, good night, sleep well, and take care of each other. Yes,